With his sister in his arms, a homeless boy knocked on the door of a rich man, asking for help. When the man saw him, he fell apart after discovering a truth he never imagined. Night had fallen over the city, wrapping it in a blanket of frost and silence. The street lamps cast a faint yellowish glow that filtered through the cold air, creating dancing figures on the deserted streets. The snow crunched beneath the weight of the few souls who dared to defy the cold, and the wind whispered like a lament lost between the buildings. Thomas, a 12-year-old boy with dark hair and deep eyes, walked with heavy, hesitant steps. Every breath he exhaled formed small clouds that vanished upon contact with the cold. He carried his little sister, Luce, only 5 years old, wrapped in a frayed blanket far too thin to protect her from the freezing cold. Luce's pale, feverish face contorted every time a shiver ran through her small body. Feeling the weight of despair on his shoulders, Thomas gritted his teeth and pressed on. The street they walked down was flanked by old buildings, whose stone walls held forgotten stories. Hunger and cold had been the constant companions of the siblings since that fateful night 4 years ago, when a car accident took their parents and left them at the mercy of an indifferent world. Every night, Thomas protected Luce, whispering stories of a safe, warm home, a place he had made up to give her hope. But this time, Luce's fever threatened to extinguish that hope, and Thomas knew he had to act quickly. A figure appeared from the shadows of a corner. Raphael, an old man with a white beard and eyes full of silent wisdom, watched the children with concern. He knew their struggles well, and had often shared a piece of bread or an old blanket with them when the night became too cruel. Seeing the distressed look on Thomas's face, Raphael approached and placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. His eyes, always full of untold stories, looked at Thomas with a mix of sadness and determination. "You have to be strong, son," Raphael said in a hoarse voice. "Don't stop protecting her, just like Raina did for you." The name of his mother echoed in Thomas's ears like a forgotten memory. A deep, old pain stirred in his chest, but there was no time for questions or memories. With a silent nod, he continued on his way. The mansion of Mr. Esteban Smith, the most powerful figure in the city, stood like a beacon in the dark, a promise of warmth and refuge that seemed almost unattainable. The journey up the hill to the mansion was a test of endurance. The icy wind battered them mercilessly, cutting into their skin like invisible blades. Thomas paused for a moment to adjust the blanket around Luce. The little girl opened her eyes for a brief moment, and a faint smile appeared on her lips before she closed them again. That gesture gave Thomas the strength he needed to keep going. At last, he reached the imposing black iron gates surrounding the mansion. The tall peaks and intricate decorations made it look like a petrified monster. With almost superhuman effort, Thomas found a small opening to slip through. On the other side, the stone path led to the main door, a majestic piece of carved wood that looked more like a wall than an entrance. He stopped before it, his fingers numb and his heart racing, and knocked with all his might. The echo of the knocks faded in the vast darkness of the night. For a moment, the silence was so thick that Thomas thought no one would answer. But then, the creak of ancient hinges broke the stillness, and the door opened a crack. Philip, the butler of the house, with a weathered face and a scrutinizing gaze, appeared in the doorway. His eyes, accustomed to indifference, softened for a moment when he saw the boy with the girl in his arms. "Please," Thomas whispered, his voice cracked with exhaustion and emotion. Philip hesitated, his mind torn between obedience to the strict house rules and the compassion that arose upon seeing the scene. Finally, against all his survival instincts in a house where every action was judged, he moved the door and let them in. The foyer, illuminated by chandeliers and a crackling fireplace, enveloped them in a sudden and overwhelming warmth. Thomas felt the adrenaline and exhaustion mix, causing him to lose his balance for a second. But before he could collapse, he held Luce tighter. From the top of the grand marble staircase, a figure appeared. Mr. Esteban Smith, with his imposing stature and cold gaze, observed the scene with a mix of curiosity and something deeper, an emotion he had not allowed to resurface in a long time. His hands clenched the banister, and an unsettling thought began to form in his mind. Lucy's labored breathing, Philip's murmur as he called for servants to bring blankets and hot water, and Mr. Esteban's penetrating stare marked the beginning of a night that would change the lives of everyone present. Fate had begun to turn, and buried secrets started to emerge from the shadows. The interior of the Smith mansion was an absolute contrast to the cold streets they had just left behind. The walls were decorated with ancient tapestries and bronze chandeliers that cast dancing shadows on the polished marble floor. The warmth from the roaring fire wrapped around Thomas and Luce, making the pain and despair fade for a moment. Philip, the stern yet compassionate butler, ordered the servants to bring thick blankets and hot water, his movements reflecting a contained urgency. Thomas, his vision blurred by fatigue and the weight of responsibility, laid Luce on a soft sofa, covering her with the blankets they had been given. The little girl took a deep breath, and although the fever still colored her cheeks, her expression seemed more peaceful in the warm refuge of the mansion. Thomas, standing next to the sofa, trembled, not so much from the cold, but from the uncertainty that consumed him. He knew that in this place, his and his sister's fate would be decided. From the top of the marble staircase, Mr. Esteban Smith observed the scene. He was dressed in an elegant dark suit, and his upright posture and cold eyes gave him an imposing, almost intimidating presence. However, seeing Thomas and Luce, something in his demeanor shifted. A subtle tremor passed across his face. Memories began to hammer at his consciousness, images of happier times, full of life and promises that had been broken. The laughter and presence of Raina filled his mind. She, with her brown hair and a smile that lit up any room, had been more than just a maid in the mansion. She had been the woman who made him challenge the strict family rules, the free spirit who had captured his heart. The betrayal and emptiness left by her disappearance so many years ago still tormented him, a pain he had never dared to face fully. Now, with these children under his roof, especially the boy who reminded him so much of Raina, a disturbing doubt began to form. Philip, who had worked in the mansion for decades, stayed close to the children, watchful. His loyalty to the Smith family and respect for Esteban were unquestionable, but his heart leaned toward compassion and justice. As Thomas stroked Lucy's forehead, Philip noticed something that made him stop. A pendant hanging from the boy's neck. It was a delicate gold piece, engraved with a lily flower design, identical to the one Raina always wore. The surprise in Philip's eyes was palpable, and unable to hold himself back, he moved closer to Thomas. "Where did you get that pendant?" Philip asked in a whisper, his voice laden with contained emotion. Thomas, not fully understanding the significance of the question, furrowed his brow. "It was my mother's," he replied, his voice low, tired, but firm. Philip's eyes misted over as he heard the answer, and his mind filled with questions. Could it be possible that this boy had a deeper connection to the family's history? At the top of the stairs, Mr. Esteban watched the exchange, his mind quickly piecing together a puzzle that had remained incomplete for so many years. Something in Thomas's protective manner and the way he cared for Luce moved him and reminded him of Raina. But the weight of doubt and guilt kept him still, watching from a distance, trapped between the desire to approach and the fear of what he might uncover. Meanwhile, Luce, feeling the warmth and security of the place, opened her eyes for a moment and met Thomas's gaze. Although weak, she smiled at him with the innocence of one who trusts fully. Thomas, seeing her, felt a wave of relief and hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The foyer, now back to its usual calm, reflected the silence of a decisive moment. Philip, his heart pounding, knew that what he had just discovered would change the course of the mansion's history and the Smith family. Unknowingly, Thomas and Luz had brought with them a truth that would begin to unearth long-buried secrets. In the shadowy quiet of the night, as the servants returned to their tasks and the fire crackled in the hearth, Mr. Esteban remained at the top of the staircase, watching the children and feeling the ghosts of the past closing in, whispering that fate was about to confront them. The Smith mansion, with its tall walls and imposing towers, seemed invulnerable from the outside, but within its walls, tension began to grow like a tangible shadow. The first light of dawn was just beginning to stain the horizon, and the city, still covered by the frost of the night, slowly awoke to a new day. However, in the mansion, the dawn did not bring comfort, but unease. Jake Smith, Mr. Esteban's older brother and the true power behind many of the family's dark decisions, sat in his private study, a lavish space filled with leather-bound books and antique objects that reflected his ambition and control. News of the children's arrival at the house soon reached him through his informants. His face, marked by the lines of years spent in intrigue and control, tightened as he heard the details. "Orphans in the mansion," he murmured with a sardonic smile as his fingers drummed on the surface of his desk. His dark eyes, rarely betraying emotion, flashed with a calculating coldness. He knew that something more was hidden behind this unexpected visit. The mansion's servants, many of whom were under Jake's influence, began acting differently. Quick movements and furtive glances intertwined in the hallways, and Philip, with his intuition honed by years of service, noticed these changes. He had worked in the mansion long enough to recognize when something was amiss. With a mix of concern and determination, he kept watch over Thomas and Luce, who were still sleeping in one of the warm rooms on the east wing of the mansion. Meanwhile, in a less ostentatious corner of the city, Mary, a young woman with dark hair and eyes full of determination, listened to the rumors about the children who had been taken in by the Smith mansion. She worked at a small bookstore, a modest place that had belonged to her mother, a woman who in her youth had been a close friend of Rena. Mary, though young, had an indomitable character and a sharp mind. The stories about Rena and her sudden disappearance were part of the tales her mother had told her, stories that always stirred a mix of curiosity and sadness within her. Driven by a desire to understand more, Mary went to see Raphael, the old man who knew the children well. Raphael, despite his age and frailty, still carried an air of wisdom that inspired respect. He pulled out an old brass box and opened it with trembling hands, revealing a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Mary read one of them aloud, while Raphael watched her with eyes full of nostalgia. "This letter, Rena wrote it shortly before she disappeared," Raphael said, his voice cracked with memories. "It talks about danger, a man who wanted to silence her. It mentions Jake." Mary's heart raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The children weren't just street survivors. They were the key to unraveling a truth that had been carefully buried. More determined than ever, Mary decided that she had to help Thomas and Luce, and that Raphael, with his memories and these letters, would play a crucial role. Back in the mansion, Philip was exploring the old hallways when a detail in the decor caught his attention. A portrait of Rena, one that had been moved to the attic by Jake's orders, gazed at him from the shadows. A flash of intuition prompted him to search further, and in a forgotten drawer, he found an envelope with letters written in Rena's unmistakable handwriting. In them, Rena recounted her fear and the certainty that Jake was behind everything. The mention of a child, our son, made Philip stop and glance toward the east wing, where Thomas and Luce were resting. Meanwhile, Jake, aware that something larger was at play, summoned his allies in the household and the police. The order was clear. He needed to uncover everything about those children and, if necessary, eliminate them. The presence of Thomas and Luce was a risk he was not willing to allow. The first steps of danger manifested when some of the servants began watching Philip more closely than usual. His movements were being tracked, and the conversations that had once been shared freely were now whispers. Philip, feeling the pressure, knew he had to act quickly. He had to protect the children and share what he had found with Mr. Esteban before it was too late. In a nearby room, Thomas, who never slept deeply, sensed the change in the atmosphere. The voices, the glances, and the unease were clear signs that something was coming. He approached the edge of Lucy's bed, where she slept with a peaceful but weak breath, and covered her carefully. With his heart racing, he swore to himself that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The dawn was casting its first light over the mansion, but inside, the shadows moved with increasing intensity. The secrets that were beginning to be revealed and Jake's imminent threat were transforming the refuge into a battleground where loyalty, fear, and courage would soon be tested. The morning sun rose slowly, casting a golden glow that illuminated the facade of the Smith mansion. But inside, the shadows of the past were beginning to stir. Mr. Esteban, in his study surrounded by shelves full of leather-bound books and family relics, gazed at an old photograph he had unearthed from his chest of memories. In it, a young Reina smiled with the warmth and freedom that had captivated him from the very first moment. Beside her, Esteban appeared with a serene smile, an image representing a time when dreams seemed possible. Their relationship had been a delicate and valuable secret, a connection that defied the rules of the Smith family. Reina, though from a humble background, radiated a light Esteban had never seen in anyone else. She was the only one who could break through his apparent coldness and make him feel that the world could be more than just money and power. But Jake, his older brother, had always been a dominating presence, an ambitious man who guarded the family's reputation and absolute control. Esteban's memories transported him to the clandestine nights in the back garden of the mansion, under the stars, where Reina spoke to him about her dreams and confessed her fear of Jake's growing hostility. Each meeting was both a balm and a condemnation. Jake, always vigilant, had noticed the changes in his brother and soon made his disapproval clear. Their arguments became more frequent and violent. Esteban clearly remembered one particular night, the last time he saw Reina. Her words still echoed in his mind. "I will protect you, no matter what." But the next morning, she had disappeared without a trace. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Philip entered with a grave expression, and in his hands, an old envelope. His eyes, which normally reflected the calm of a man accustomed to obedience, now showed a mix of determination and anxiety. "Sir, there is something you need to see," he said, extending the letters. Esteban took the envelope, and as he read the first lines, his face turned pale. Reina's words spoke of an imminent danger, a plan to protect her son. Esteban lifted his gaze, incredulous, as he understood the meaning of those confessions. Thomas could be his son, the pendant, the letters. Everything pointed to a truth that had been too close and that he, blinded by pain and guilt, had never perceived. As the mansion began to stir with the news that Jake was mobilizing his resources to learn more about the children, Sydney, Jake's wife, sensed the change in the air. Although for years she had been a silent witness to her husband's actions, a woman satisfied with a life of luxury and comfort, the arrival of Thomas and Luz had made old questions stir in her mind. In her moments of solitude, doubts about Jake's morality and the shadows that always surrounded him had haunted her, but she had kept her distance, fearful of the consequences. Sydney began searching through her husband's study, a space she had always considered forbidden. Amid business papers and forged documents, she found receipts and letters that linked Jake to acts far beyond ambition, conspiracies and bribes to silence those who stood in his way. Among these papers, one name stood out: Reina. Sydney's blood ran cold. She understood that Reina's disappearance hadn't been a simple escape, but something much darker. With trembling hands, she hid some of the evidence in her purse. She knew she was taking an enormous risk, but something inside her, a remnant of conscience and humanity that still beat, whispered that she had to act. Meanwhile, Thomas, who had begun to overhear the adults' conversations, fell into confused thoughts. The fragments he had heard about Rena, about her connection to the mansion, sparked memories of his mother, images of a smiling and protective woman who told him stories before bed. Who was his mother, really? And why did it seem that the mansion held so many answers about her? Jake, aware that something larger was at play and that something was slipping from his control, clenched his fists as he received a report from one of his spies. Esteban was moving, and the servants were beginning to talk about the children. With contained fury, he decided he could no longer afford to be patient. If Esteban or anyone else discovered the truth, everything he had built would collapse. Tension spread like wildfire through the mansion's walls. Every character, from Philip with his newfound resolve to Mary planning her next move with Raphael's letters, knew that danger was near. The shadows of the past, long hidden, were becoming denser, and the Smith mansion was preparing, knowingly or unknowingly, for a confrontation that would shake its foundations. The constant murmur of the mansion, a mix of footsteps, whispers, and the creaking of wood, grew deafening for those who understood that a storm was approaching. Philip, still shaken by Rena's letters and the revelation that Thomas might be Mr. Esteban's son, walked the halls with a blend of fear and resolve. The mansion felt like a labyrinth where secrets whispered from the walls and shadows watched. As Philip pondered his next moves, in the city, Mary and Raphael advanced with their own investigations. The young woman, holding the bundle of worn letters in her hands, went to the small bookstore that had once belonged to her mother, a place where the stories of the past intertwined with the present. Sitting under the dim light of an oil lamp, she read one of Rena's letters aloud. "If anything happens to me, I know they won't silence you, Raphael. Protect Thomas. He must never know who he really is until it's safe." Mary's voice broke as she read the words. Rena's intent became clear. She had trusted Raphael to safeguard a secret that was now on the brink of being unearthed. "That boy is more important than anyone realizes," whispered Raphael, his gaze lost in the distance, focusing on the memories of a promise made to Rena years ago. The mention of Jake and his involvement in the letters confirmed his suspicions. Not only had he been behind Rena's disappearance, but his ambition had led him to commit even darker crimes. Back at the mansion, Thomas, who had spent the morning restless, watched Luce sleep soundly in bed. The fever that had threatened to consume her was beginning to subside thanks to Philip's care and the warm blankets. However, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was only temporary. The furtive glances of the servants and the tense air confirmed something was wrong. Philip ventured into the west wing of the mansion, where the attic, filled with dusty trunks and forgotten memories, hid more secrets than anyone dared to admit. There, in a dark corner, he found a wooden box that had once belonged to Rena. He opened it with trembling hands and found a small notebook wrapped in cloth. Inside, Rena recounted her fears and the final days before her disappearance. She spoke of Jake and how she had started to perceive his growing violence and paranoia. Jake didn't just want to control everything. He feared that anything outside his power would be a threat. Even Esteban, even me, one of the entries read. The words confirmed Philip's worst fears and led him to a devastating conclusion. Thomas had to be protected at all costs. Meanwhile, in the main hall, Mr. Esteban was receiving Gray, the independent journalist Mary had contacted. Gray, a man with a sharp gaze and a notebook always in hand, was there to hear the story that no one had dared to tell until now. Mary entered the room, her steps firm, and spread the letters and documents she had gathered. The evidence was conclusive. Jake had been behind Rena's disappearance and had maintained a veil of corruption over the city. "Do you know what this means?" Gray asked, his eyes sparkling with the promise of a story that would change everything. Esteban nodded, but his gaze drifted toward the door, as if expecting someone to open it at any moment. He knew his brother wouldn't sit idle once he discovered the truth was about to come to light. On Jake's side, he had received word that someone was snooping around his affairs. A loyal servant, who had witnessed the meetings between Esteban and Philip, informed him of the unusual movements at the mansion. The fury and fear intertwined on Jake's face, hardening it. He gave quick, precise orders to his corrupt allies, urging them to act before his grip on power slipped away. Realizing the danger was imminent, Mary sought out Philip and told him what she had found with Raphael. Philip, holding Reina's notebook, confirmed that they could no longer wait. Thomas had to know the truth, and Esteban had to act before Jake unleashed chaos. Thomas, who had been listening from the hallway, felt that the world was becoming clearer and more terrifying at the same time. His fists clenched as he understood that the mother he had loved so much had not only been the victim of a mysterious disappearance, but had fought to protect him until the very end. The mansion, bathed in the changing light of the day, prepared for the inevitable. Loyalties aligned, and the secrets that had been hidden for so long began to rebel. The air, thick with anticipation and danger, announced that what was to come would forever change the history of the Smith family. The sun had reached its highest point, casting a glow that, from a distance, gave the Smith mansion a serene and grand appearance. However, within its walls, calm was only an illusion. Every corner of the house vibrated with a tension that seemed palpable, an echo of the truths about to be revealed and the forces preparing to face the inevitable. Jake Smith, the dark patriarch of the family, was in his study, a place decorated with art pieces and hunting trophies that spoke of power and dominance. The news that Esteban had started to move, to protect the children and to investigate old wounds, had irritated him beyond measure. He called one of his contacts in the police, a captain who had been his accomplice for years in covering up his business and eliminating obstacles. "I can't let my brother keep digging where he shouldn't. I want surveillance on the mansion, discreet but effective. And if anyone tries to interfere, make sure they act," ordered Jake, his voice as cold as the gaze that accompanied each word. The captain, a man with a weathered face and a hard gaze, nodded on the other end of the line, knowing that obedience to Jake was not an option, but a necessity to keep his life comfortable and risk-free. In the mansion, Philip was pacing the hallways with hidden urgency. He had spoken to Esteban, and the decision to protect the children and confront Jake had been made, but the fear of retaliation lingered in the air like an invisible presence. Thomas, who hadn't left Luce's side since the previous night, noticed Philip's hurried movements and the way some of the servants looked at him sideways, as if carrying a secret they didn't want to share. Thomas's unease grew as the whispers and glances became more noticeable. Conversations in the hallways stopped as soon as he passed, and the servants quickly dispersed, as if they feared being caught. Inside, a mixture of fear and determination began to take shape. He remembered Raphael's words and the stories about his mother, Reina, that Mary had begun to tell him. His mother hadn't just been a fighter. She had been a protector, someone who had made sacrifices for him and Luce. That certainty gave him strength, but also an unbearable weight of responsibility. Meanwhile, Mary was searching for Philip in the mansion. She had spent the morning reviewing documents and talking with Gray, the journalist who had decided to get more deeply involved in the investigation. Gray, with his penetrating eyes and his notebook full of scribbles and dates, understood the gravity of what they were about to expose. Jake has allies everywhere. This isn't just a family matter. It's a network of power that goes far beyond, warned Gray, as he flipped through the letters and documents Mary had gathered. "I know, and that's why we can't back down now. The truth must come out, and Thomas and Luce need to know who they are and why their mother fought so hard," Mary replied, her voice firm but laden with a lingering concern. Elsewhere in the mansion, Sydney, Jake's wife, observed her husband's movements with growing anxiety. She knew he wouldn't stop at anything to maintain his control, and that if he felt his power was threatened, he would act with the coldness and violence that defined him. Sydney, who had found evidence of Jake's actions and secretly handed it over to Mary, felt that time was running out. Every time Jake passed by the hallway with his hard expression and determined stride, a chill ran down her spine. She knew she was risking everything, but the weight of complicity and fear had become unbearable. As the evening began to paint the sky with shades of orange and purple, Philip called Esteban to the mansion's old library. The heavy curtains blocked some of the light, giving the space an air of conspiracy. Esteban, standing next to one of the windows, watched the mansion's long shadow stretch across the gardens. He had spent days reading and rereading Reina's letters, each word a stab that reopened wounds and awakened memories he thought were buried. "We have to move now," Philip said, breaking the silence. In his hands, he held Reina's notebook and a letter he had found that morning, one that described in detail how Reina had feared for her life and Thomas's at Jake's hands. "What do you suggest?" Esteban asked, though he already knew the answer. His eyes reflected the internal struggle between fear and determination. "Protect the children and prepare the mansion for whatever may come. Jake won't stand idly by, and you know that," Philip replied, his words filled with urgency and loyalty. Thomas, who had overheard part of the conversation from behind the door, decided that he could no longer remain on the sidelines. With stealthy steps, he entered the room. His presence surprised Esteban and Philip, but the look in his dark eyes was not that of a defenseless child. It was the gaze of someone willing to fight. "I want to know everything," Thomas said, his voice firm despite a slight hesitation. "I want to know who my mother was and why Jake wanted her out of the way." Esteban looked at Thomas, and in that moment he knew he could no longer protect him with half-truths. Philip nodded, and between the three of them, the story that had been hidden for so long began to unfold. The secret love between Esteban and Reina, Jake's growing obsession with controlling the family, and Reina's sacrifice to protect Thomas and Luz. With each word, Thomas felt a knot unravel in his chest, releasing both pain and determination. Meanwhile, Jake, informed of the movements within the mansion and Gray's presence, ordered his men to prepare for action. The corrupt allies in the police and his loyal servants received precise instructions. The plan was simple and brutal: ensure that the evidence disappeared and that the children were taken from the mansion at all costs. The mansion, once a symbol of power and legacy, was now becoming a potential battlefield. Mary, noticing the unusual movement of some of the servants and the evasive glances, understood that the confrontation was imminent. She ran toward the wing where Thomas and Luz were resting, followed by Gray, who had already started recording his observations in his notebook. The tension in the mansion was palpable, as though the walls themselves were waiting for what was about to happen. Sydney, watching from the shadow of the upper balcony, felt her breath quicken. She knew that her decisions in the coming hours would define her future and that of the children. Her gaze met Jake's, who looked at her with a calculating expression, as if he knew something was stirring behind her facade of obedience. Finally, the sun set, and darkness fell over the Smith mansion. The lights began to flicker on one by one, but what they illuminated was nothing more than the prelude to the storm. The conspiracy, which had been an open secret for years, was about to explode, and no one, not even Jake, could stop what was coming. The night loomed over the Smith mansion, enveloping the structure in a veil of dimness and silence. The flickering lights of the chandeliers and oil lamps cast moving shadows on the walls, as if the house itself contained a dark secret struggling to break free. The air was thick, charged with the expectation and fear of those who knew that the inevitable was about to unfold. Jake had set his plan in motion. From his office, he looked at the mansion with a calculating, determined expression, knowing that tonight would determine his future. His men, loyal allies and corrupt police officers, moved under the shadows of the gardens and exterior hallways, coordinating an operation that had been in the works for weeks. The orders were clear. They had to take Luz and eliminate any obstacle, no matter the cost. Philip, aware of the imminent danger, moved through the mansion's corridors, his footsteps muffled by the oriental rugs. In his mind, he replayed the plan he had discussed with Esteban and Mary. Protect Thomas and Luz, ensure that the evidence collected by Gray and Mary wasn't lost, and prepare for whatever was necessary. At his waist, an old revolver from his youth reminded him that tonight, he wasn't just a butler. He was a protector, ready to fight. Thomas, sitting at the edge of Luce's bed, looked at his sister with a mixture of tenderness and worry. The warmth of the fire in the fireplace created a comforting contrast in the room, but inside him, anxiety grew. He remembered Esteban and Philip's words, the secrets revealed, and the courage he now needed to channel. Luce, still recovering from the fever, slept with a peaceful expression that almost made him forget the shadows moving beyond the door. The first sign of the attack was subtle, the creak of wood and a whisper that quickly faded. Philip, in one of the central hallways, looked up at the sound and felt a chill run down his spine. He quickened his pace and headed toward the east wing, where Thomas and Luce were. Just before rounding the corner, he saw a group of figures dressed in black entering through the back door, moving with the precision of a trained team. "Alert!" Philip shouted, his voice cutting through the silence and reverberating down the hall. Chaos erupted in an instant. Jake's men, alerted by Philip's shout, quickly scattered. Some ran toward the east wing, while others dispersed in search of Gray and Mary, knowing that the evidence was as important as the children. The mansion, which until moments ago had been shrouded in tense calm, was now filled with rapid footsteps, murmured orders, and the echo of drawn weapons. Thomas felt his heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo in his ears. He sprang up and shook Luce, who opened her eyes with a sleepy and frightened expression. "Luce, listen to me. We have to move," Thomas said, his voice firm but filled with urgency. The little girl, not fully understanding what was happening, nodded and allowed her brother to take her hand and lead her toward the wall at the far end of the room. Philip had mentioned a secret passage days earlier, and Thomas, with the determination to protect his sister, pushed a wooden panel that slid open with a soft groan. Philip reached the room just in time to see Thomas and Luce disappear into the passage. He closed the panel behind them and turned to face the intruders who were already approaching down the hall. He raised the old revolver and aimed, his face reflecting the mixture of fear and resolve that only a man with too much to lose could have. "No one is getting past here," he warned, his voice trembling slightly, but holding the necessary firmness. The first two men stopped, surprised by the resistance. However, a third man, taller with a scar on his face, advanced with a mocking smile. Philip's shot rang out in the hall, and the intruder fell to the ground with a muffled scream. The reaction was instantaneous. A chaotic confrontation broke out, with blows, struggles, and screams echoing through the mansion. Meanwhile, Mary and Gray, who had been reviewing the last documents in the adjacent room, heard the commotion and looked at each other in panic. Without wasting time, Gray shoved the papers into his jacket and nodded to Mary, who ran toward the children's room. The footsteps were getting closer, and both knew they were racing against time. Mary reached the hallway just as Philip was facing the attackers. A flash of recognition passed between them, and without hesitation, Mary joined the fight. She grabbed a bronze candelabrum and wielded it as a weapon, surprising one of the men who had been trying to sneak up behind Philip. The blow landed with force, and the intruder fell to the floor. Gray, armed with little more than his wits and unexpected courage, faced another man, using a chair to block a blow and shove the attacker against the wall. The tension in the hall reached its peak, and every second felt like the balance was dangerously tilting back and forth. Meanwhile, Thomas moved through the dark passage with Luce by his side, trying to keep their steps as silent as possible. He could hear the shouting and the crash of the struggle through the walls, but he forced himself to stay calm. Luce, holding tightly to his hand, trembled, but kept her eyes fixed on her brother, trusting him more than anything in the world. "Come on, Luce, it's almost over," whispered Thomas, trying to reassure her. The passage ended in a small service room that Rena had used in the past, a forgotten corner of the mansion where memories of his mother seemed to come alive. Thomas looked around and noticed a small chest covered in dust. With no time to waste, they hid behind it, their breaths shallow and their bodies tense. Back in the hallway, Philip, Mary, and Gray managed to push the attackers back. One of the men, aware that time was running out, shouted, "Retreat! Jake wants the children found no matter what." The group dispersed, knowing that the mansion was too large and that every second increased the chance of more resistance. The footsteps faded and silence reigned again, broken only by the heavy breathing of Philip, Mary, and Gray. "Are you all right?" Mary asked, her voice breaking with the effort. Philip nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the hidden door through which Thomas and Luce had escaped. He knew the fight had only just begun, and that Jake, seeing that his first attempt had failed, would return with even more force. In the refuge, Thomas held Luce and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the beat of her heart against his chest. He was not alone. He had his sister, those who protected him, and the memory of his mother giving him strength. But he knew the night was not over, and that the battle for truth and justice was far from over. The Smith mansion, which had witnessed generations of secrets, was now a witness to a confrontation where the past and present collided, and where everyone's lives depended on what would happen next. The dawn stretched over the Smith mansion like a cloak of uncertainty, and every corner seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the outcome. The oil lamps sputtered in the hallways, and the smell of smoke and gunpowder lingered in the air. The first wave of the attack had been repelled, but the tension, far from dissipating, had only intensified. Philip, leaning against the wall with one hand on his side, tried to catch his breath. The wrinkles on his face, accentuated by the flickering light, told the story of a man who, despite the years, had found a new purpose: to protect the children that Rena had left behind. Mary, still breathing heavily, approached him and touched his shoulder, her eyes reflecting both worry and determination. "Philip, we can't stay still. If Jake comes back, he'll come with more men and more force. We have to protect Thomas and Luce," she said, her voice filled with urgency. Philip nodded, rising with difficulty. He knew the fight had only just begun, and that time was working against them. In the silence that followed, they looked at each other, both aware that what was at stake was not only the children's future, but also that of a family that had been victim to the reckless ambitions of a man. In the north wing of the mansion, Mr. Esteban sat in his study, surrounded by the evidence Gray and Mary had gathered. Rena's letters, Gray's notes, and the receipts Sidney had handed over were spread across his desk like a map of the pain and betrayal that had engulfed the family. The weight of the truth hit him like a gale force, and for the first time in years, he felt that the guilt that had tormented him might give way to redemption. Gray entered the study, his notebook in one hand and a serious expression on his face. "Esteban, we have to move. Jake isn't going to wait for us to take the initiative. We need to take this to the police before he takes more violent reprisals," he said, pointing at the documents. Esteban looked up, his dark eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. "I know you're right, Gray. But if we do this now, without making sure Thomas and Luce are safe, Jake will use them as hostages to silence us. We need a plan that exposes him without putting the children in more danger." The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the conversation. Sidney, Jake's wife, burst into the room, her eyes reflecting panic and resolve. She had been waiting for the moment to act, to redeem herself, and she knew she could no longer be a bystander. "There's no time, Esteban. Jake is preparing to return, and this time he won't be alone. He's called more men, and they're on their way," she said, almost breathless. "I've done everything I could to delay him, but if we don't act now, it will be too late." Esteban looked at her, surprised by her bravery. For years, Sidney had been the silent, complacent figure beside Jake, but now he saw in her a spark of courage that only emerged when desperation pushed one to the brink of action. "Sidney, take Gray and make sure this evidence gets to the police," Esteban ordered, handing her the most important papers. "And you, Gray, spread the word. Let the city know the truth." Gray nodded, understanding the gravity of the task. Sydney, with the documents in hand, followed him toward the door, but before leaving, she turned to Esteban one last time. "Save them. Save those children," she said, her eyes shining with contained tears. Elsewhere in the mansion, Thomas and Luce remained hidden in the small room where they had found refuge. Luce's breathing was more regular, but her eyes reflected the confusion and fear that she barely understood. Thomas, with his ear pressed to the door, listened to the footsteps and voices that came and went, each sound a sign of impending danger. "Thomas, I'm scared," Luce whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas turned to her and hugged her tightly. He felt her heartbeat against his chest, but the need to protect her was stronger than the fear that paralyzed him. "Nothing will happen to you, Luce. I'm here, and I won't let anything bad happen to you," he said, trying to sound more confident than he actually felt. The hallway door creaked open, and the shadows of several figures were projected onto the wall. Thomas held his breath and pushed Luce behind the chest, covering her with his own body. The footsteps drew nearer, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. A loud knock sounded at the door of the room, and Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the worst. "Thomas, it's Philip." The butler's voice rang out with urgency, but also with relief. Thomas let out a trembling sigh and quickly opened the door. Philip and Mary entered, shutting the door behind them and blocking the entrance with a heavy piece of furniture. "We need to get them out of here right now. Jake is preparing a bigger attack, and this time there won't be a chance to escape if he finds us," Philip said, his voice low but firm. Mary picked up Luce, who clung to her with the trust of someone finding shelter in the middle of a storm. Thomas, although exhausted, nodded with determination. He knew that the only way to defeat Jake was to face him, but not without ensuring Luce was safe first. A loud crash at the mansion's main entrance confirmed what everyone feared. Jake had returned, and this time with more armed men. The shouts and the sounds of doors being struck reverberated through the house as the loyal servants to Esteban tried to hold back the intruders. Mr. Esteban emerged from his study, confronting his brother in the hallway, surrounded by the echo of the battle and the flickering flames of the lamps. "Jake!" Esteban shouted, his voice filled with rage and pain. Jake turned around, a twisted smile on his face, his eyes burning with fury. "So, you finally decide to face me, brother," Jake responded, stepping forward confidently. "This ends today. You've dared to defy me and put in danger everything I've built. I won't let a couple of orphans and a handful of papers destroy everything." The ensuing confrontation was a clash of wills and years of accumulated resentment. Jake's men tried to advance, but Philip, Mary, and a few loyal servants stood in their way, forming a desperate barrier to protect the children. Thomas, seeing his uncle Jake for the first time so close, felt a mix of fear and hatred. The stories he had heard about him, the letters from his mother, and the truth he had started to uncover fueled a rage he had never felt before. But before he could act, an unexpected voice broke the tension. "Stop, Jake!" Sydney's voice rang out from the entrance, and with it, a group of police officers Gray had managed to alert. Jake's expression turned to one of shock and disbelief. "This can't be," he whispered, taking a step back as the police officers advanced with drawn weapons. Sydney, holding the evidence in her hand and with a firm gaze, looked at Jake one last time, knowing she had broken the yoke that had kept her prisoner for so many years. "It ends here, Jake," Esteban said, his voice heavy with solemnity and weariness. Jake, cornered and with no way out, let his shoulders slump, knowing that his reign of terror had come to an end. The flashing lights of the police sirens illuminated the mansion's entrance, and Jake's men were arrested one by one. The battle was over, but the echoes of secrets and truths revealed would linger for a long time. Thomas, still trembling from the intensity of the night, hugged Luce tightly, feeling that, for the first time in years, the darkness that had surrounded them was beginning to dissipate. The sun was beginning to peek shyly over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple that heralded a new day. The Smith mansion, which had been the scene of the battle and the collapse of Jake's dominance, stood in expectant silence. The echoes of the confrontation still vibrated through the walls, and the air, dense and dust-filled, seemed to hold its breath before what was to come. Mr. Esteban stood in the hallway, his shoulders weary and his gaze fixed on the floor, where papers, splinters of wood, and stains from a violent night told the story of the battle they had just fought. Jake had been arrested, and his loyal men had been subdued by the police, now alerted and unable to rely on corruption after the public revelation of their crimes. However, the peace following the victory was a fragile illusion. Gray, with his notebook full of notes and additional documents, approached Esteban. His eyes, always so sharp and alert, now reflected a new kind of fatigue, the weight of having witnessed the fall of an empire built on secrets and unchecked ambitions. Esteban, the city knows the truth now. I've sent the evidence to my editor, and by tomorrow everyone will know about Jake's crimes and his corruption network, Gray said, his voice low but tinged with triumph. Esteban nodded, but his gaze shifted to the door, as if waiting for something or someone to give meaning to everything that had happened. Thomas, who had overheard the conversation from the entrance to the hallway, stepped forward and stood beside Esteban. His eyes reflected a mixture of questions and a sadness far beyond his years. "So, is it all over?" Thomas asked, unsure whether he should feel relief or an indescribable loss. Esteban leaned down and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a more paternal gesture than he had shown since the truth had started to come to light. Before he could respond, an uneasy murmur among the servants interrupted them. Their gazes turned to the entrance of the mansion, where a dark, slender figure was outlined under the dim light of dawn. The footsteps were soft, but resonated with the force of a revelation. When the figure stopped under the archway of the entrance, the sunlight illuminated her face, and Esteban's eyes widened with a mixture of disbelief and hope. It was Rena. Time seemed to freeze, and for a moment the Smith mansion held its breath. The servants stood still, and even the sound of sirens in the distance seemed to fade. Rena, head held high and with the same determined gaze Esteban remembered, advanced with confident steps. The years of absence were etched in the lines of her face, but the spark of courage was still there, intact. "Esteban," Rena said, her voice firm but tinged with contained emotion. Her eyes met Thomas's, and the boy, his lips trembling, felt his whole world shatter and rebuild at once. "Mom!" Thomas shouted, breaking the silence and running toward her. Rena embraced him, sealing years of separation and suffering. Her hands, rough from life in the shadows, stroked Thomas's hair as tears ran down her face. Esteban took a step forward, feeling a lump in his throat that made it impossible to speak. All the weight of the years of regret and pain pressed down on him. But seeing Rena there, alive and whole, something inside him broke and healed at the same time. "How?" Esteban asked, unable to contain the emotion in his voice. Rena looked at him with a mix of tenderness and firmness. "I never stopped fighting, Esteban. When Jake tried to get rid of me, I had to disappear. I spent years hiding, moving from place to place, protecting Thomas from afar and looking for evidence to dismantle his power network," she explained, dropping a thick envelope onto the table. The letters and documents inside confirmed everything Gray had exposed, and more. Jake's conspiracy, the crimes he had concealed, and the threats that had loomed over her. Philip, who had been observing the scene from the shadow of the hallway, stepped forward, his eyes wet with tears. "Rena, I knew it. I always felt it. That you hadn't abandoned Thomas. That all of this wasn't the end," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Philip. You were my pillar from afar, my hope that someday all this would make sense," Rena replied, looking at him with gratitude. Mary, who had been standing in the corner, stepped forward with Luce still in her arms. The little one, who had been watching the scene with wide, curious eyes, looked at Rayna with a mixture of strangeness and familiarity. Rayna approached her, and Luz, seeing her mother's smile, stretched out her arms with the natural trust of children who recognize love. "You are my Luz, my little one. Forgive me for being away for so long," Rayna said, embracing her with a tenderness that only a mother can give. Luz, not fully understanding, simply smiled and clung to her. As the first rays of the sun flooded the room, Rayna's presence brought not only answers, but also a breath of life and hope. But the calm didn't last long. A police officer entered the mansion, his face tense and his eyes searching for Esteban. "Mr. Smith, we have a problem. Jake escaped during the transfer," he announced, and the echo of those words fell like a blow across the room. Rayna's face hardened upon hearing the news, and Thomas, still clinging to her, felt a shiver run through his body. Esteban clenched his fists and looked at Rayna with a mixture of fear and resolution. "If he's escaped, he'll come for what he couldn't get." "He'll come for us," Esteban said, and everyone present understood that the battle wasn't over yet. Rayna, without letting go of Thomas or Luz, looked at Esteban and the others with a spark of defiance in her eyes. She had returned to protect her family, and she wasn't going to let Jake destroy them. The story of the Smiths hadn't ended yet, but this time they were ready to face it together. The news of Jake Smith's escape spread like wildfire throughout the mansion and beyond, reaching the darkest corners of the city. Those who owed him loyalty or feared his power began to move, some seeking to protect themselves, others eager to take advantage of the uncertainty. For Esteban, Rayna, Thomas, and the others, the threat of Jake loomed like a dense, tangible shadow, promising to return with devastating force. The Smith mansion, normally a symbol of power and opulence, had become a fortress besieged by fear and anticipation. The remaining police officers on site reinforced security and checked all entrances, but everyone knew that if Jake decided to attack, it wouldn't be a simple maneuver to stop him. The previous night had proven that his resources were vast, and his ambition insatiable. Gray, the journalist, was in the hallway reviewing his notes and organizing the documents that Rayna had brought. The evidence was clear, irrefutable, and within hours, the city's newspapers would be flooded with headlines exposing Jake as the mastermind behind a network of corruption and crime. But Gray also knew that the press would only do its part if they all made it out alive. Rayna, her face more serene than anyone expected, watched Thomas and Luz as they slept together in one of the inner rooms. Seeing her children together, safe, even if only for a moment, gave her an unshakable strength. Her years in hiding had been marked by solitude, constant danger, and the need to move forward when everything seemed lost. But now, the warmth of her children nearby fueled her and reaffirmed her decision to fight until the end. "I won't rest until this is over," Rayna said softly, but loud enough for Esteban, who had entered quietly, to hear. "Neither will I," Esteban replied, approaching her. His eyes, filled with sorrow and hope, moved from the children to her. "Rayna, I regret everything I made you endure, everything I failed to see. But I promise you I won't let Jake touch them." Rayna nodded, and although there were wounds that time couldn't erase, seeing Esteban so determined and present made her feel that maybe, after all, redemption was possible. The moment was interrupted by a distant rumble, a sound that resonated like a warning echo. Their eyes met, and without saying a word, they both knew that the waiting time was over. At the main entrance of the mansion, police officers and security guards began to move with a nervous urgency. Shouts and orders filled the air as reinforcements hurried to take their positions. Jake had returned, and this time he brought a force greater than any previous attempt. Black vehicles stopped in front of the gate, and dark figures descended, armed and with determined expressions. Philip, who had been watching from a high window, pressed his lips together with concern. He was a man who had dedicated his life to serving, but that night he had discovered that true loyalty went beyond servitude. It was about protecting what he considered family. "Esteban, they're coming here. This time there's no doubt they're not just trying to intimidate," he said, turning to the man he now considered more a friend than a master. "I know, Philip, and we're ready too," Esteban replied, grabbing a gun that had been sitting in a drawer for years. His hands, once used to signing documents and giving orders, now gripped the weapon with the resolve of a man fighting for his family. The sound of gunfire shattered the tranquility, and the mansion erupted into controlled chaos. Police officers and Jake's men clashed in a fierce battle that echoed through every corner of the house. Rena, keeping Thomas and Luce safe in a rear room, felt fear attempting to take over, but she suppressed it with the overwhelming need to protect them. Mary, armed with courage she hadn't known she possessed, stood guard at the door, ready to act if anyone tried to enter. "Mary, if something happens," Rena began, but the young woman interrupted her. "Nothing will happen, Rena. We're not losing this battle," Mary said, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and defiance. As the confrontation intensified, Jake stormed into the foyer, escorted by 2 armed men. His expression was that of a cornered predator, yet still lethal. His eyes scanned the room, searching for Esteban, Rena, the children, anyone who could be used as a bargaining chip. "Esteban!" he shouted, his voice reverberating through the walls. "I warned you! This won't end well for you!" Esteban appeared at the top of the grand marble staircase, weapon in hand, and a look that reflected a mixture of fury and defiance. The scene tightened into an eternal second, as if the house itself held its breath. "This ends today, Jake. No more secrets or lies can sustain your power," Esteban responded, his voice resounding firm. Jake twisted his lips into a crooked smile and, with a swift motion, had one of his men fire at the ceiling, causing a chandelier to explode and shower sparks and glass fragments. In the confusion, Jake began to move towards the stairs, but before he could get close, a shot rang out from the side. Philip, pale and with a trembling hand, had fired, wounding one of Jake's thugs, who fell to the ground with a cry of pain. The battle turned chaotic. Police officers and Jake's men exchanged fire, and the foyer became a battlefield. Rena, hearing the shots and screams, looked at Thomas and Luce with determined eyes. "Stay here, no matter what happens," she said, and before Thomas could protest, she stepped into the hallway. Mary followed her, armed with an iron bar, and both joined the group defending the central wing of the house. Jake, upon seeing Rena, paused for a moment, surprise and rage fighting for dominance on his face. "You," he murmured, but before he could react, Esteban stepped between him and Rena. "Enough, Jake. No more games," Esteban said, and the final confrontation between brothers materialized in that instant. Jake, cornered, looked around. His men were falling, and the police were advancing. With a roar of frustration, he tried to take Rena as a hostage, but a precise shot from a police officer stopped him cold. Jake staggered, his expression reflecting disbelief and defeat as he fell to his knees. Silence descended, broken only by the labored breathing of those present. "It's over," Rena said, looking at him with a mix of compassion and firmness. Jake, eyes burning with fury, tried to speak, but his voice faltered before he could utter a word. The officers took him and escorted him out as the dawn began to light up the mansion, which had been witness to generations of secrets, betrayals, and now, justice. The sun, now high in the sky, bathed the house in a new light. The debris, the marks of the struggle, and the tired faces of those who had fought were a reminder that freedom and truth came at a cost, but also that sometimes sacrifice and bravery could prevail. Thomas and Luce ran to their mother when calm returned. The three embraced, a circle of love that had withstood the darkness and was now strengthened in the light. Esteban, eyes filled with tears and a heart beginning to heal, watched them, knowing that this image was the redemption he had been seeking. Mary and Philip, along with Gray, gazed at the sunrise, knowing that the Smith family's story would no longer be defined solely by power and deceit, but by courage, and truth. The sun rose slowly on the horizon, casting warm rays of light that filtered through the mansion's large windows. The house, which had been the setting of so many secrets and confrontations, now breathed an odd and comforting peace. The servants, who had spent years walking on tiptoe through its halls, moved with renewed freedom, exchanging looks of relief and shy smiles. The air was no longer dense, but light, filled with promises of new beginnings. Thomas sat in the garden under the shade of a large oak tree. Luce, with a carefree laugh, ran through the rose bushes, her small bare feet brushing against the grass. The little girl had fully recovered, and the vitality she now displayed was a reminder that the storm had passed, and life, somehow, continued. Thomas watched his sister with a smile that mixed joy and a maturity imposed by years of struggle and responsibility. Raina, watching them from the terrace, felt a wave of emotion as she saw them, safe and happy. Her years in the shadows had been hard, marked by uncertainty and solitude, but seeing her children at peace made every sacrifice worth it. Esteban, beside her, offered her a cup of tea, and for a moment they shared a comfortable silence, the kind of silence only found between those who had shared pain and redemption. "I never thought I would see this day," Esteban finally said, his voice low and filled with emotion. Raina looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding and a spark of hope. "I didn't either, Esteban, but here we are, and we have a chance to start over, to make things right." Esteban nodded, a solitary tear sliding down his cheek before he quickly wiped it away. The weight of guilt had lightened, but it would never fully disappear. However, the possibility of a better future, of making amends for his mistakes, was a gift he would not waste. Inside the mansion, Gray stood by the large dining room table, reviewing a copy of the newspaper that had published his article. The headline, "The Fall of Jake Smith, The Truth Behind Power," stood out in bold print and was the talk of the town. Gray, who had pursued the truth for years, was finally seeing the fruits of his labor. He looked up and saw Mary enter, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "You did it, Gray. The city finally knows the truth," Mary said, walking toward him. "I didn't do it alone, Mary. Without you, without Rena, without everyone who dared to challenge Jake, this never would have been possible," Gray replied, and for the first time, he allowed a full smile to spread across his face. Mary nodded, knowing that though the struggle had been hard, it had been worth it. She thought of her mother, of the stories she had told her about Rena, and the kindness she always saw in her. Now, standing beside Rena and her children, helping to build a future for them, was a way to honor that memory. "The city will change, and so will this family. No more secrets, no more shadows," Mary said, and her words resonated like a promise. Meanwhile, Sydney, who had decided to stay until everything stabilized, was in the library. She held a letter in her hand, one she had written for Rena. In it, she explained her regret, her desire for redemption, and how she planned to start anew, far from the Smiths, but with a clear conscience. Sydney knew her role had been passive for too long, but helping to expose Jake and protect the children had given her back some dignity. "It's time to go," she whispered, leaving the letter on the table before stepping into the hallway. She paused for a moment as she saw Raina and Esteban on the terrace, and a small smile crossed her lips. She knew she didn't belong to that story of redemption, but she had been part of its outcome. The days that followed were filled with activity and reconstruction. The mansion, which had been a symbol of power and secrecy, transformed into a home. The hallways echoed with Lucy's laughter, Thomas's lively conversations, and Mary's frequent visits, now a more integral part of the family. Philip, who had decided to stay in the house, became an honorary grandfather to the children, telling them stories of courage and goodness that always ended with a wink and a smile. Gray continued publishing articles that unraveled the web of corruption Jake had woven for years. His work inspired other journalists to follow his example, and soon the city began to change, shedding the shadow of Jake and his accomplices. The streets, once silenced by fear and oppression, were filled with conversations about justice and renewal. One day, Reina and Esteban sat together in the garden at the same tea table where they had once shared dreams and hopes in the past. Esteban, with a reflective look, took Reina's hand and held it gently. "Everything I've done to get here, Reina, I'd do it all again for this moment. Thank you for coming back, for giving us the chance to make things right," he said, his words laden with sincerity. Reina looked at him, and although there were wounds that would never fully heal, there was also love and forgiveness. "We are here, and that's what matters. Now it's time to build, to create a future where Thomas and Luz can grow up without the weight of the past." At that moment, Thomas and Luz ran toward them, their laughter filling the air. Thomas, who had been the guardian of his sister and had faced so much, now ran with the freedom of a child who could finally be one. Luz, with her overflowing energy, jumped into Reina's arms, and the embrace they shared was a promise of love and safety. Philip and Mary, watching from the shadow of a nearby tree, exchanged looks of satisfaction. "The story of this family has changed, and we've been part of that," Philip said, his voice filled with pride. "Yes, and that means we've done something good, something that truly matters," Mary responded, and the sparkle in her eyes confirmed that she was ready for whatever came next. The day passed, and the Smith mansion, which had been a witness to betrayals, love, and redemptions, was filled with a new light. The future was uncertain, but this time it was full of possibilities. Reina's letter, the one she had written during the dark days of her disappearance and had been rescued by Philip, now hung in the main room, framed as a reminder that, despite the shadows, truth and love would always find a way to prevail. The sun set behind the hills, coloring the sky with a warm golden hue. In the garden, Thomas and Lucy's laughter echoed like a melody, and Reina and Esteban, hand in hand, watched as the night fell, knowing that, for the first time in a long time, they were truly home. The story of the Smith family is a powerful reminder that the truth, no matter how long it is hidden or how many forces oppose its revelation, always finds a way to come to light. The shadows of betrayal, ambition, and power can envelop even the most untouchable places and people, but love and bravery have the power to cut through any darkness. Reina's courage in fighting silently for the safety of her children, Thomas's determination to protect his sister, and Esteban's redemption in confronting his past teach us that sacrifice and the will to do what is right can transform even the most tragic stories into ones of hope and redemption. This story speaks to us about the power of family and second chances, how the bonds of love and loyalty can prevail over ambition and corruption. In the end, the true wealth of a family does not lie in its possessions or status, but in the ability to overcome adversity together, learn from mistakes, and build a future based on truth and love. The Smith mansion, a symbol of power for generations, becomes a home where wounds heal and life renews, showing us that even after the darkest night, there will always be a dawn. Thank you for joining us on this exciting journey through the story of the Smith family, where love, betrayal, and redemption intertwine in a plot full of emotion and learning. If this story has inspired you or made you reflect on the power of truth and the importance of family, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more content filled with deep and reflective stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to read what you think about this ending. Until next time, and remember, there is always light after the darkness. See you in the next story.